everybody. Just a quick little bit of bio information for those of you who have not heard one of my previous lectures. I was a Newsday staff writer for 34 years and wrote primarily about maritime issues and history. And I left in 2014 and primarily to write Long Island history books. And what you're going to hear tonight is a short summary of the fifth book on George Washington's Culper Spy Ring. So people are still coming in, but we'll get going and let them catch up to us. All right. So everybody, I'm hoping, knows who this gentleman is, George Washington. And I'm not sure that anybody or very few of you will recognize this gentleman. There's a sketch of Robert Townsend done by his nephew in the early 1800s. And George Washington, in theory, never knew who he was, and nobody else during the Revolution, except other members of what became known as the Culper Spy Ring, knew what he was, which is one reason the ring was able to function throughout the war and help the Continental Army win the war. So the story of the Culper Ring has fascinated historians and history buffs ever since the Revolution, particularly from the 1930s on, when there started to be history books about it, and especially in 2014 through 2017 with the airing of Turn on AMC, which got people very interested in the subject, even though it twists the history quite a bit. Later on, I'll tell you some of the reasons why it's bad history. There's also a lot of misinformation besides Turn, which we'll talk about. A lot of legends, such as Anna Strong using her clothesline to signal Chief Spy Abraham Woodhull where to meet courier Kayla Brewster bringing his whaleboats from Connecticut, are sort of turned into fact when there's not necessarily proof of what's going on. But Washington knew the value of military intelligence and the problems you had if you didn't have military intelligence early on from the French and Indian War, when he was a colonial officer who accompanied a British column going west across the Alleghenies to fight the French and Indians out in the area of what's today Pittsburgh. They had no idea what the British and their Indian allies were doing, and they blundered into an ambush and were almost wiped out. Washington miraculously survives and leads the survivors back to the east. But he's keenly aware from that moment on that if you don't know what the enemy's doing, you're at a great disadvantage. So when he takes over as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army after Lexington and Concord, he knows he's fighting the greatest military power in the world, and he needs to know what they're doing or he's in trouble. So throughout, before and after the Battle of Long Island, which occurs in August of 1776, and turns out to be the biggest pitched battle of the entire war, he knows when he doesn't have intelligence, he's at a great disadvantage. So in the Battle of Long Island, the British sail into New York Harbor unopposed. They land on Staten Island. And then Washington has no idea what they're going to do. So he's defending both Manhattan and Brooklyn, both of which are basically indefensible. And he has to sort of work back and forth because he doesn't know where the British will strike, because he's got no spies or reconnaissance on Staten Island where the British are. The British eventually come across the harbor, land in Brooklyn. They surprise Washington and his army by going very far east and then around through Jamaica Pass. They get behind the bulk of the Continental Army and could have won the war and the battle probably on that day if General Howe hadn't gotten cautious and stopped the attack. Washington, as you probably know, escapes across the East River at night, thanks to fog and the wind keeping the British fleet down in the lower bay. But he's keenly aware that he's barely escaped with some great luck, and his army could have been wiped out. So he's very concerned about creating a military intelligence network, which he does. And historians ever since were trying to figure out how it worked and who was in it. And the biggest unveiling of this information came in the 1930s when Morton Pennypacker, a historian from Suffolk County, writes one book in 1930 identifying all the players in the spy ring, at least the major players, including Robert Townsend being the chief spy in the city. And Then later he proves that Robert Townsend was Culper Jr., the chief spy in the city, by doing handwriting analysis of comparing Culper letters to Townsend's business account books. So as I said, Washington, this is a painting done after the war showing the Washington getting his artillery out of Brooklyn over back to Manhattan. And as soon as he's safely back in Manhattan, which turns out not to be safe for long because of another surprise attack across the East River, Washington knows he needs to get his act together on intelligence gathering. So in August of 1776, not long after the Battle of Long Island, he tasks Colonel Thomas Knowlton to form a unit that's job is to gain intelligence either through spying or reconnaissance. So Knowlton gathers the officers from his new unit at their headquarters down in Lower Manhattan, and says, "I need a volunteer to go on back to Long Island, which is now fully in enemy hands, and try to gain information." And he just asked the officers because they don't trust enlisted men to do this safely. Every officer there declines, not because there's so much cowards or afraid. It's that in that age, to be a spy, if you were a gentleman or an officer, was considered disreputable and dishonorable. So nobody wanted to debase themselves by becoming a spy, which was about the lowest thing you could be. Luckily for Knowlton, one officer's not there. That's Nathan Hale. You see his statue down by City Hall. Hale was sick during the meeting, but he hears from his colleagues what was said. And he goes to Knowlton and said, "I've been in the Army for a year. I haven't done anything to earn my pay or advance the Continental's Army's cause, so I will be your spy." His friends in the unit immediately try to talk him out of it, both for the honor issue, but more importantly is they know that Hale, who's a Yale graduate, is a very open personality. They tell him, "You're the last person who could carry off a false identity or lie to a century or, British if you were questioned." But Hale says, basically, "I need to do this," and he goes ahead and plans it. So he decides he will portray a Dutch schoolmaster. And Hale is not a very good spy. He leaves behind a lot of his valuables and things that would identify him, except he takes his Yale diploma with his real name on it with him, which is not very good spycraft. So he goes with a Sergeant Hempstead, who's a friend of his. They go up the Connecticut shore as far as Norwalk, where they think they can cross the Sound without being intercepted by British warships patrolling out on the waters. When he gets to Norwalk, he runs into a friend, Charles Pond, who is the captain of a privateer vessel, who had been a member of Hale's regiment in Connecticut earlier in the war. So he's ferried across the Sound to what is now Hale site north of Huntington, with there's a lot of variations in the account of what happened with Hale, just as there are variations in the story of the spy ring itself. So either he went with the sergeant or left the sergeant in Norwalk, but he crosses the Sound. He lands in what is now Hale site north of Huntington, and leaves everything else behind that could identify him, including his silver shoe buckles, and starts heading west on Long Island, trying to gain information about what the British are up to and how people feel about the British occupation. The problem for Hale is he faces a very formidable, as bad a spy as Hale turns out to be, he's facing one of the most skilled intelligence officers in the world. That's Robert Rogers. He led a unit called Robert Rogers Rangers in the French and Indian War, and he sort of fought Indian style and fought behind enemy lines, and was just a great commander and had a good reputation, and there's been novels written about him. During the Revolution, he approaches George Washington for a commission in the Continental Army. Washington doesn't offer him what he wants, and then he goes to General Howe and gets a British commission as a colonel to form a loyalist unit called the Queen's American Rangers. In the middle of all this, Washington tries to have him arrested, but he escapes. So he's basically playing both sides to get the best deal for himself. But Howe tells Rogers his job is to patrol Long Island Sound, try to get intelligence on Long Island, even though it's occupied by the British. His job is to find out if there's spies and what's going on that the British regular soldiers can't find out. So to help Rogers do his job, they give him a ship called the HMS Halifax that's at his disposal. And the Halifax captain he gets tipped off about these two privateers, which are private vessels commissioned by the government to attack enemy vessels. The captain hears that two privateer vessels had crossed the Sound the night before. So he realizes it's too late to catch up to them. So he tracks down Rogers. Rogers comes aboard, and they start hunting for the spy or spies that they assume came off of Pond's vessel. Their best guess is that the spy or spies are heading west towards Brooklyn, which is now in enemy hands. And so Rogers has the captain of the Halifax put him ashore in Sands Point. Begins heading west and asks people, have they seen any strange person, asking questions and looking suspicious. And a lot of the loyalists that he talks to say, yeah, this guy was just here going west. So eventually, either that day or early the next day, Rogers catches up to Hale at a tavern where he's having dinner. And Rogers sits down and sort of invites himself to join Hale, gets him talking, tells Hale that he is a Continental soldier in disguise and his job is to gather intelligence. And Hale basically says, "Oh, that's exactly what I am, what I'm doing." And so Rogers said, "We should talk some more tomorrow at the tavern where I'm staying. We can have breakfast together." What he really wants is he wants to have witnesses to get Hale confess again so that he can be arrested. So the next morning, Hale comes to Rogers inn, and they have breakfast, and there's a couple of Rogers Rangers at the table. And as soon as Hale has admitted again that he's a spy, Rogers grabs him, says, "You're under arrest," and they take him by ship into Manhattan to General Howe's headquarters. It's night. They wake up Howe. Howe quickly signs a death warrant, and the next day he's hanged. There's a lot of misinformation, disputes about what happens, including where Hale is actually hanged, and also about what he said. Also, there's dispute about whether Hale was actually heading west or had finished gathering information, was heading back to Huntington to cross the Sound again on the privateer. A lot of research is still going on, but there's a lot of disputes. In any case, one of the biggest disputes is, what did Hale say when he's standing on a ladder waiting to be hanged? He almost certainly did not say what you probably heard in fourth grade history lesson: "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Nobody actually recorded him saying that, and that line comes from a play of that time called Cato by Joseph Addison. And it seems like a historian in the 1830s put that phrase into Hale's mouth, but he never really said it. So this attempt at spying, the first attempt by the Continental Army, is a total failure, and Hale pays with his life. Washington still knows he needs to get intelligence, so it's not clear why, but he hires a businessman from Fishkill up on the Hudson who works in the city to form a intelligence network. His name is Nathaniel Sackett. What his credentials were, I have no idea, and it's never been clear why Sackett is hired. Turns out to be a bad choice. He doesn't do a very good job, and Washington fires him after a month. But Washington does make a very good choice. He realizes Sackett is a civilian, and he needs a liaison with the Army, who should be a junior officer. Washington's very good at picking talented young officers to surround himself with, including Alexander Hamilton. The person he picks to be the liaison is Benjamin Talmadge, another Yale graduate, a classmate of Nathan Hale, who even before the Battle of Long Island joins the Army in Connecticut, becomes a cavalry officer, and gets Washington's attention in battles around Philadelphia. Washington puts him on his staff. and then says, okay, you're the liaison between Sackett and me. So they arranged to get the first spy over to Long Island, a Major John Clark, a Pennsylvania lawyer who joined the Army about the same time as Talmadge. And he's very good at it. As bad as Hale was, Clark is very good. He establishes a whole network of contacts and informers, gathers intelligence for much of 1777 without arousing any suspicion by the British. His messages, he's carried across the Sound on a whaleboat from Connecticut, and the messages are sent back to Connecticut the same way. So meanwhile, Washington fires Sackett, and then sends Clark back to Philadelphia to gather intelligence there, because that's considered more important than Long Island. So he's got an intelligence vacuum in and around New York again. Luckily for him, it doesn't last long, because he gets an unsolicited letter from Kayla Brewster, whaleboat captain, again from Setauket, another friend of Talmadge. There's a whole group of friends and relatives that end up involved in the spy ring. This is a 1950s mural from the Setauket School showing Kayla Brewster, the whaleboat captain, on the right, meeting with Abraham Woodhull, who becomes the chief spy for the Culper Spy Ring a little bit later. So Kayla Brewster had started out carrying Clark's messages back across the Sound. Then with Clark on, Brewster writes an unsolicited letter to Washington on August 7th, 1778, which is a date that sort of is the unofficial beginning of the Culper Spy Ring. Brewster writes to Washington. He said, "I'm on Long Island Sound all the time with my whaleboats. I can gather information there about British movements, and I also go to Long Island frequently and make my way around, so I can give you intelligence reports about British troop dispositions." Washington is thrilled. He's heard of Brewster, who's kind of fearless, and tells him, "Spare no expense to get whatever you need and get me accurate information as quickly as possible." Brewster writes his first report 2 weeks later, saying that Sir Henry Clinton, who's now the British commander, is moving to attack the Patriot forces occupying Newport, Rhode Island. That helps Washington alert the garrison. They beef up the troops. They improve the defenses, and the British find out about it and don't attack. So that's Washington is extremely pleased with Brewster. So you have the beginning of a spy operation thanks to Brewster. Talmadge is also working to come up with some kind of arrangement. What he does is Washington says, okay, rather than having another civilian, he tasks General Charles Scott, who's the commander of Virginia Infantry Brigade, to become the new spy chief. The problem is Scott is stationed north of the city with an infantry unit that's fighting, so he's pretty much consumed with that. He's not particularly interested in espionage anyhow, and doesn't seem to be a particularly energetic or intelligent officer. So most of the work falls to Talmadge, who's still the number two. Talmadge starts recruiting people he knows, particularly Abraham Woodhull, who I showed you in that painting. This is Woodhull's house in Setauket, and has not survived. It was burned down several decades ago. Woodhull agrees to become the principal spy, reporting to Talmadge. And in the beginning, he would go to the city periodically and get information on Long Island, give it to Kayla Brewster to get across the Sound to Talmadge, and then on to Washington. We don't know exactly when Woodhull starts spying, but we know from the letters that come out of the spy ring that by October of 1778, the operation is fully functional. So the members of the spy ring are very consumed with intelligence, because they know the British has they have spies and counterintelligence people, and they've been doing this for hundreds of years, and the Americans are amateurs just trying to figure it out from scratch. So with Scott's approval, Talmadge develops a list of code names for the key players. Washington is believed to have invented the name Culper, because he was when he was 17, he was surveying in Culpeper County, Virginia. And the thought is that he took the Culpeper name and sort of shortened it to Culper, and that's how the name of Culper comes along. In any case, the name assigned to Abraham Woodhull is Samuel Culper, and that gives rise to the Culper Spy Ring name after the war. Talmadge takes the name of John Bolton, and all the other key players get similar names. Here's another image of Talmadge in his cavalry uniform. So Scott is not doing a very good job. Scott is a favor of the sending people piecemeal behind enemy lines, a la Nathan Hale, and it doesn't work. When they try it, a lot of the people they dispatch are also captured and or killed. Talmadge says the better method is to have somebody either who's already behind enemy lines feed them information, or send somebody there, let them stay there, sort of embed them into the local scene so they won't attract attention. So there's a lot of tension between Scott and Talmadge, and Scott's method is not working. Washington's getting frustrated. Finally, Scott tells Washington he's going to give up being spy chief and actually give up being in the army and retire to Virginia. Washington is relieved. And then instead of finding yet another general or big civilian, he sees how good a Talmadge is, and he elevates Talmadge, who's only 24, to be his, what he calls, director of military intelligence. So for a while, Woodhull is traveling back and forth from his farm in Setauket, gathering information, but he faces not only sentries by the East River, but there's loyalist patrols and loyalist brigands out there who keep stopping him, searching every inch of his clothing and his saddles. Woodhull is a very nervous individual to start with. He continually asks Washington and Talmadge to destroy every letter from him as soon as they read it. They do it initially and then stop, which is how we know a lot about the spy ring, because their letters have been handed down and are now in museums. But after being stopped repeatedly and getting more and more scrutiny, Woodhull becomes more and more nervous. And he finally says to Washington and Talmadge, it's just not safe for me to go to the city anymore. We need to find somebody in the city who can get information to me out in Setauket. They all look around for likely suspects, and it's Talmadge who comes up with, it's Woodhull who comes up with the best choice. When he goes into the city, he stays at the boarding house of his brother-in-law, Amos Underhill. And when he's there, a frequent lodger is Robert Townsend from Oyster Bay, who's in the city managing as a shipping agent for his father, Samuel's shipping and import business in Oyster Bay. So they spend a lot of time together at the boarding house, and Woodhull decides Talmadge seems to have the right personality and political leanings to be a spy, and he's recruited to be the spy in Manhattan. So Woodhull then changes his name to Culper Sr., and Robert Townsend becomes Culper Jr. This is a picture of Townsend. We have no, other than that drawing I showed you earlier, we don't have any images of Robert Townsend. This is a painting by Moore Kunstler, the Oyster Bay artist and famous historical artist, have his interpretation of what Townsend would have looked like. And this is set in Raynham Hall, his house in Oyster Bay, although most of the spying he did was in the city. Townsend agrees to work for the spy ring with one condition. He said nobody other than Talmadge and Woodhull and the couriers who come in to pick up information can know who he is, including George Washington or anybody else in headquarters, because they all know that the British have spies in Washington's headquarters and troops around protecting him. So things get started, and the route, now that they have somebody in the city, is shown on this map. So Townsend is in the city. Occasionally Woodhull will still go in and gather information. They send, if Woodhull goes in, or they develop a group of couriers who can ride in. So they cross the East River with the letters. They ride 55 miles out to Setauket. They give the information to Woodhull, who rendezvous with Kayla Brewster, who comes over with several whaleboats to take it across the Sound to Norwalk, or another town in that area. Initially, Talmadge is waiting. He rides to headquarters north of New York City, gets it to Washington. Eventually, Washington says to Talmadge, "You're too valuable to be on the road all the time. So Talmadge assigned some of his dragoons, groups of 3 every 15 miles from the shore to headquarters as a relay to get the message as quickly as possible. Quickly as possible is relative. It takes as long as a week to make this circuit one way. If Townsend, if Talmadge or Washington wants to get information to the spies in Setauket in New York, they send a message back the same way. And the fact that it can take a week to make one circuit is a continual frustration for George Washington. He said, the information when it gets here is often too late for me to do anything about it, or I've heard from somebody else before, and all you're doing is telling me something I already know. So throughout the war, they try, at Washington's urging, to come up with a quicker route, and they try across Staten Island. They try going straight north from the city, but they don't have the right people, and it's too dangerous because of the British occupation. They try from Port Washington, and that doesn't work. So for the entire rest of the war, for 4 to 5 years, they keep going through Setauket because they just can't come up with a better alternative. This is another mural from Setauket School showing Austin Rowe, the chief courier, on his horse heading out for Setauket after crossing the East River. So initially, they're writing letters in plain text, which means if they're, other than the code names that they're using, the full information in the letter, if they're captured, and some of the letters are captured in British raids along the Connecticut coast, you could, easily, they don't have to be deciphered because they're in plain text. And they realize this isn't going to work very long. This is one of the early letters, and it's in plain English. The only thing that disguises it, you see SC, that's short for Samuel Culper. So this is one of the early letters before Townsend comes along and Woodhull becomes Culper Sr. We know at this point that there are 193 letters that survive either as originals or copies, totaling 383 pages. These are written by the spies or Kayla Brewster or Washington or Talmadge. But new ones keep popping up periodically. Most recently, last summer, the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook, their curators were in the basement because they were closed during COVID and just tidying up their records. And they find an account book that says they had received a donation of a letter from the Spy Ring in 1951, but it was never cataloged. Nobody working there now had ever heard of it. And they got it authenticated, and then you may have seen the story I did in Newsday a Sunday a month or two ago about it. This is the front page, and that's the back page. There's sort of an online exhibit about it now, and they're going to actually start to display it on Culper Spy Day in September for a while. Now, this letter is interesting because it's the only known letter that survives from Talmadge to Townsend. And this is still early. It's signed John Bolton. Over the course of the war, everybody involved, particularly Talmadge, is fixated on the fact they just have to keep increasing their security and their spycraft so that they're not exposed and all put on the gallows if they're caught. So they take several steps over the course of the war to make themselves more secure. So the first one was the code names that I mentioned, Samuel Culper Jr. This is a graphic from the Free Village Historical Society in Setauket. You can see the names, the aliases, and what they do then is they come up with a code name. Woodhull comes up with the idea and starts to use it in 1779. They just start replacing common used words with digits. So they use it. Number 10 replaces New York, for example. Western Road becomes 44. 20 becomes Setauket. So the letters, start to need some deciphering if they're captured. They do this basic numerical cipher. Talmadge uses it in 10 letters bound for New York and 20 coming the other way, and then he decides this is not secure enough. So in July of 1779, he upgrades the system dramatically by preparing what he calls a dictionary, which with a new, greatly expanded code. This is an image of that code book. The only one that survives that we know of was Washington's, and it's in the Library of Congress, which is where this image is from. So what Talmadge does is he takes 710 words that were the most likely to be used, such as Congress, gun, Navy, Tory. He writes them in alphabetical order in that first column, and then opposite each one is a number that would replace it in the reports. So many becomes 384, murder becomes 387, and then get some examples. He also fine tunes it by taking 53 prominent proper names and giving them numbers. So Talmadge then becomes 721 instead of John Bolton. Woodhull is 722, Townsend 723, Western Row is 724, Kayla Brewster 725, Washington's 711. And then the place names like New York become three digits like 727. Long Island is 728, Setauket 729, and so on. Beyond those words with given their own digits, there's a coded alphabet for words not listed where they use letters to replace numbers and vice versa. So between the initial coding and this final dictionary, which they use for the rest of the war, they come up with the best security of all, which they call the stain. And the stain is basically invisible ink. And unlike earlier inks that could be detected, like writing in milk or lemon juice, which are visible when they're heated, the stain is impossible to uncover unless you apply a second chemical that they call the counterpoint. And the stain is invented by James J., a doctor and amateur chemist who spends time in London before the war. He's the brother of John Jay, who becomes the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So John Jay writes a letter to Washington, said, my brother has come up with this stain, and if you write letters in it, it's impossible to detect until you apply the second chemical. Washington is excited. It takes several months for James Jay to make enough to send Washington a sample. He tries it, he loves it, says, send me all you can. Takes several more months before Jay comes up with enough that the spies can get it and start to experiment with it. And despite the fact that Washington says, I will get you whatever you can get, the chemicals are hard to find. Washington tells Jay to go to any military hospital and requisition whatever you need under my name. And Jay said, that's only part of the problem. I need a laboratory like I had in London. So Washington has his engineers built a lab for Jay, but the chemicals are so scarce that there's months where they can't get any, and then they have to go back to just writing letters in code without the secret stain. But the stain is great because what they'll do is they write in the margins of letters, they write in the margins of books, or they write on a blank sheet of paper inserted in a ream of blank writing paper, and it's impossible to discern what's there without the second chemical. So this is the basic operation of the spy ring. It's a lot more complicated, but it gives you some idea of how it was formed and how it operates. What I want to do now, spend a little time on some of the areas of controversy, because there's plenty of disputes about how the spy ring actually operated and who was doing what. Probably the most commonly known story about the spy ring is the role supposedly played by Anna Strong's clothesline out in Setauket. You may have heard this. It's in turn as fact. It's in books by Brian Kilmeade and others as fact, although there's the proof for this is very sketchy at best. So the story goes, and this has been handed down through Strong family history, the Strongs still live in Setauket. The story is that if Kayla Brewster had arrived either to drop off messages or pick up messages, there'd need to be a system to alert Abraham Woodhull at Setauket where to meet Kayla Brewster in one of 6 little bays and coves around Setauket. So the story goes that when Brewster showed up, he would go to Anna Strong's house and say, I'm here. Anna Strong would then put a black petticoat on the clothesline at her servants' quarters to alert Woodhull, who lived across the bay, that Brewster had arrived. Then she supposedly would put between 1 and 6 handkerchiefs on the clothesline, and that would tell Brewster, and it would tell Woodhull which cove Brewster was waiting in. So there's no firm historical documentation for the story. It's a great story. People like the idea of having a woman intimately involved with the spy operation. Anna Strong is the husband of Judge Selah Strong, the most prominent official in Setauket. He's a magistrate and leaders of the town government. The problem is the documentation. So Pennypacker in his 1939 book said that he and other historians had spent years trying to track down information about how Woodhull knew where to find Brewster. And then he writes, finally, a clue was found among the papers of the Floyd family, meaning William Floyd, the Declaration of Independence signer from Mastic. And when this was compared with the Woodhull account book, it was discovered that the signals were arranged by no less a personage than the wife of Judge Selah Strong. The story is picked up in the 1960s by family historian Kate Strong. And she wrote a book of family history, and she has a chapter titled In Defense of Nancy's Clothesline, because the story was being attacked a lot of the time by historians who said it was great legend, but it wasn't real. She wrote that the story was collaborated by scraps of paper, deeds, journals, and letters in her possession, as well as documents she saw or was told about by Morton Pennypacker. Those documents are now in the East Hampton Library. They do not make a very compelling case that this ever happened. Many historians still repeat the story without skepticism. Now, it's possible that this happened because if they needed to communicate, this is one way to do it, and it's a clever way to do it. It's also possible that Anna Strong just either rode a boat across the harbor to Woodhull's house or rode a horse around the bay to his house. But we also know that a lot of the rendezvous were prearranged. There would either be a notice in the letter saying, oh, I'll be back in 2 weeks, or we'll meet in 2 weeks. And they easily could have, when they met to exchange information, could have said, okay, let's make our next rendezvous in this cove on this date. So it's not clear that there's really any need for this kind of communication if everything is prearranged. So it's possible, but right now I just treat it as legend. There's also a lot of controversy over the role of this gentleman, James Rivington. He's a publisher of very strident Tory newspapers in New York before and during the Revolution. He so angers the Sons of Liberty and the other Patriot groups that they attack his office and destroy his printing press. Rivington retreats to London, but then comes back when the British take over and starts yet another newspaper called the Royal Gazette. And he attacks the Patriots, makes fun of George Washington, and prints news about what the British are up to. It's widely read by Patriots and Tories in New York because they want to know what he knows. But his role in the spy ring, if any, is subject to great debate. Some people have him as a full-fledged member of the Culper Spy Ring, which is doubtful. Some people have Robert Townsend, whose mercantile shop is right across the Hanover Square from Rivington's newspaper, as either a volunteer or paid correspondent for the paper. Some people say he's co-owner of the newspaper. Rivington also owns the adjacent coffee shop and general store. And some people say that Townsend had some arrangement that he co-owned the coffee shop, and it was a great place for him to hang out and eavesdrop on the British officers who stayed there. Lots of rumors. No proof of any of this. Even Pennypacker cast some doubt on his role. He said that James Rivington ever imagined Robert Townsend to be in the service of George Washington. There is no evidence to show. In fact, it is very unlikely. Rivington was not the type of man that Townsend would trust with that secret. Even going further than that, Townsend writes a letter in 1779 to the Ring saying that Rivington's Gazette is writing that there are spies rampant in New York. Everybody needs to be on the lookout to find them and capture them. That's not the kind of thing that Rivington, even if Rivington was a spy, that sort of raises a lot of suspicion. Not the smartest thing for somebody who's one of the spy members to do. Plus, Townsend keeps immaculate, very detailed information in his account books, and the only reference to Rivington is buying the newspaper. There's no account of he buys writing paper from the general store, but there's no evidence of any other connection. So I treat this connection as legend as well. This gentleman is John Andre, who's Talmadge's counterpart. He's the chief spy for the British and the British spy master. He's involved, as you may know, about with Benedict Arnold and his turncoat activity and trying to turn West Point over to the British. John Andre ends up in a lot of the spy legends as well, because in one letter, Woodhull writes in August of 1779, he mentions a woman with the code of 355, which translated as woman. And he writes, this is about a month after Townsend takes over the spying in the city. And he said, I intend to visit 727, which is New York, before long, and think by the assistance of a 355 or lady of my acquaintance shall be able to outwit them all. So this is the only reference to any woman in all those 193 letters. This has given rise to a whole subgenre of spy gossip and spy speculation, just like Anna Strong's clothesline. So Brian Kilmeade, in his best-selling book, Pennypacker and others have taken this brief reference to woman and turned her into a full-fledged member of the Culper Spy Ring. Kilmeade even goes as far as to call her Agent 355, although the idea of a secret agent or an agent as a spy, that term was never used till long after the Revolution. And the speculation gets pretty wild. Pennypacker suggested that not only was there a female spy with the code number 355, but she was the mistress of Townsend. Others connected to Townsend in various ways. And it's not clear why, if she was connected to Townsend, that the only mention of her is in a letter from Woodhull out in Setauket, and the spying is taking place in New York. So it gets a little crazy. Bev Tyler, the historian in Setauket, who was a major source of my book, thinks it was Anna Strong that he was taking to the city because she would often ride in with him to try to give him some cover. But there's no evidence of an Agent 355 or even a female spy. Now, Andre turns into the story. This is another one of the rumors that has arisen around the spy ring. People say that Robert Townsend's younger sister, Sally, who's out in Raynham Hall, overheard Andre plotting to take over West Point, and with Benedict Arnold, after his treason was set in motion. Now, Andre did stay at Raynham Hall to visit his friend, Colonel John Simcoe of the Queen's Rangers. Sally supposedly overhears the conversation, gets a letter to her brother, who alerts George Washington and Talmadge about it, and that's how they capture Andre and hang him, and almost capture Benedict Arnold, who gets away. The problem is Simcoe was at Raynham Hall about a year before all this events are taking place. So this is a total fabrication that makes absolutely no sense. But this is all the kind of stuff you see around the spy ring if you don't analyze it. Now, I badmouth Turn a lot. I'll just give you a couple of reasons why. I credit any of the books, including Brian Kilmeade's book, which I call historical fiction, with the emphasis on fiction, because he invents dialogue throughout the book when they have no idea what anybody's saying, and they don't even say that they invented the dialogue. But Turn is even worse. It got people very excited about the spy ring. People think it's great TV. I wasn't very excited. I did a story for Newsday saying I thought it was mediocre TV and trashed its version of history. But a couple of the things that bother me about Turn, starting with that they have the spy ring originating in 1776 after the Battle of Long Island, when in fact it took 2 years more before the spy ring is formed. They show Setauket as this very established community of stately brick homes because they film it in Virginia near Williamsburg, when Setauket at that time was this little cluster of saltbox wooden houses, minor thing, dramatic license. They have all the British troops on Long Island as regular military redcoats, when in fact most of the troops on Long Island were loyalist units, like you see the Queen's Rangers with Colonel Simcoe here in a Don Troiani painting. Again, not the worst thing, but there's two really pretty awful things that they do that are just way far from the real history. Abraham Woodhull, as obviously is a patriot, as is his father, a local minister out in Setauket, who is also firmly a firm patriot supporter. In the show, if you've seen it, if you remember, the British get wind from their own spies and informants that Woodhull is actually a spy. And after this information is passed along, Simcoe takes the Queen Rangers out from Oyster Bay to Setauket to try to arrest Woodhull and question him. When they get out there, Woodhull luckily is in New York gathering information, and so what they do is they grab his father, and they almost beat him to death trying to get information about his son's activity and his son's whereabouts. In turn, they show the elder Woodhull as a Tory sympathizer, and when you first meet him, he's having tea with Simcoe and the other British officers and making fun of the revolution. So that's a pretty big departure from the real story. But the worst thing of all is, if you've seen the series, they spend the first 20 minutes talking about introducing Woodhull and Anna Strong, and they set them up with a romantic relationship. Anna Strong is 10 years older than Woodhull. She's happily married to Cecil Strong, and she's got 6 young children to occupy herself. And they're related through marriage, and they're friends, but in turn, they have this secret love affair, which is just preposterous. So I couldn't watch the whole series because the historical mistakes just made me crazy. So the question then is, how valuable was the spy ring when you know the real story? The players thought it was pretty important. Talmadge, and again, he's biased, it's a spy ring. He writes in a memoir he writes for his children after the war that, quote, how beneficial it was to the commander-in-chief is evidenced by his continuing the same to the close of the war. Now, he did use it, but there were times when the spy ring sort of ceased operation when they thought they were in danger, particularly after Benedict Arnold switches sides. The first thing he does is go into New York and goes looking for spies, and they arrest about 30 people. Luckily, it's none of the prime players in the spy ring. But Townsend is so unnerved by this, he leaves the city, and the spy operation grinds to a halt for many months. And this kind of annoys Washington because his eyes and ears are no longer working. Washington goes from extremely positive about the spy ring to very sour by the end of the war, in part because of these gaps when they're not working and supplying information. And it's an ongoing concern because it takes so long for the information to get to him. And then at the end of the war, he's down in Virginia leading up to and after the Battle of Yorktown. So what's going on in New York is sort of a backwater and less interest to him. But in the letters, this is really a major shift over the course of the war. He writes in July of 1780 that he found the intelligence to be, quote, of very great importance, close quote. In another letter, he states, I rely upon this intelligence. In April of 1781, he writes that of their ability, I entertain a high opinion. So right in the beginning, he's very high. He praises them. Their intelligence is detailed. It's very accurate, very useful, except it's coming to him late. End of the war, and actually, Washington learns in a letter from Townsend that the British have agreed to end the war and recognize American independence. After that, the spy ring has no reason to operate. The spies who never get paid but are reimbursed for their expenses submit their unpaid expenses to Talmadge, who sends them on to Washington. Washington is unimpressed, tells Talmadge he wants more documentation, more justification. And he writes in the letter in September 11, 1783, he shows his greatest displeasure yet with the spy ring. He writes about Woodhull, quote, the services which were rendered by him, however well meant, was by no means adequate to those expenditures. because his communications were never frequent and always tedious in getting to hand. So Washington, is not pleased with the spies by the end of the war, but pretty much every historian agrees that they made a significant contribution. It's just a question of how much. I like to pick on Brian Kilmeade because I think he's just guilty of almost incredible hyperbole, starting with the subtitle of his book. He calls it the spy ring that won the revolution. So he literally credits the spy ring all by itself for winning the war, which every other historian thinks is just kind of a ridiculous claim. But they clearly, most historians are somewhere in the middle between Washington and Kilmeade, saying they were valuable, but they weren't the main reason that the war was victorious. But there's a lot of examples of their value. Continually throughout the war, Woodhull and Kayla Brewster are providing information about the British on Long Island. They're recommending places that could be attacked successfully. And there's at least 3 or 4 examples when Talmadge takes the information to Washington and they approve raids across the Sound by whaleboat. The most successful is another of the murals in Setauket, called the Battle of Fort St. George. There was a colonial plantation on the South Shore in Mastic, which was fortified with blockhouses and a stockade. When Brewster and Woodhull tell Talmadge that there's a small garrison of Tory soldiers that would be easily overcome, and more importantly, there's 300 tons of hay stockpiled nearby in Coram. Washington gives the green light for the raid, so Talmadge comes over, captures the fort in a surprise attack, burns the fort, burns the British supply ship in the background there, takes some of his men to Coram, burns the hay, and then they get back to Connecticut with all their prisoners and not losing one of the Patriot soldiers. Another instance is Townsend writes a letter telling Washington that a sailmaker named Christopher Dynacek, who is portraying himself as an ardent patriot and intelligence gatherer, is really a double agent working for the British. And he's put out of business. It's not clear what exactly happens to him. Probably the biggest, they also provide intelligence about British trying to attack Rhode Island. That helps stave off attacks. Probably the biggest impact is a letter from Townsend in November of 1780 saying that the British have come up with a good way to counterfeit Continental currency. The British have been doing that since the beginning of the war. Their thinking is if they can flood the market with phony Continental bills, it will create inflation and devalue the currency to the point that the Americans won't be able to fight the war anymore. But every time they do it, it's on the wrong paper, and merchants and anybody that knows the real currency can immediately tell it's counterfeit. But in that letter in November 29, 1779, Townsend tells Talmadge, who tells Washington that the British have acquired the same paper in Philadelphia that the Continental currency is printed on, which means the counterfeits will be undetectable. Washington is alarmed. He writes a letter to Continental Congress a week later after he gets the letter from Townsend. Congress, for some reason, waits 3 months, but then they recall all the currency and print new money, foiling the British's plot. So there's plenty of examples of the spy ring contributing to the war effort, even though Washington discounts a lot of that by the end of the war. So I want to wrap up with a postscript, which takes place in 1790 after Washington is now president. Alexander Hamilton, who becomes the first Treasury Secretary, recommends in 1789 to Washington that he should spend some time going around the colonies and meeting his constituents. So he takes a long trip around New England in 1789, and then in the spring of 1790 decides to take a 5-day trip out to Long Island. Now, Hamilton gives his explanation in his writings of why Washington should take these trips. Washington agrees it's a good idea. Washington is a farmer and interested in soil, interested in crops and agriculture. And his diaries of these trips is filled with who's growing what, and the soil conditions are good or bad or indifferent. And this is his private diary, so you think he would say what he's really doing. But a lot of historians, and I'm not sure I'm one of them, think the real reason, or one of the reasons Washington makes this trip, and this is a painting of his carriage, is that he wants to go to Long Island to meet and thank members of the spy ring. To me, it's a kind of a flimsy story, but there are some connections that are known with the spy ring. So Washington makes a loop of 165 miles. He rides along the South Shore from Brooklyn out to Jamaica, out to Patchogue. And in Patchogue, he stays at the home of somebody known to be a minor player, an informant in the spy ring. So that's one connection. Then he goes north through Coram up to Setauket. And then continues along the North Shore to Huntington, stays for a night in Roslyn. Here's a modern painting of that. The other strong spy connection is he spends the night in Setauket, and he spends the night in Row Tavern, which is still there. And it's owned by Austin Rowe, who is the chief courier of the spy ring. So you have a very strong connection between Washington and the spy ring, at least in theory. The problem is Washington never says anything about knowing any of the spies. And when Rowe is down on the South Shore, when he learns that Washington is heading to his tavern to spend the night, in galloping to try to get there and get set up for Washington's visit, Rowe is thrown or falls off his horse and breaks his leg. So we don't know if Rowe ever even got to the tavern in time or was held up on the South Shore. Rowe never writes about what happened after he's thrown from the horse. Washington talks about a delightful stay at Rowe's Tavern, that the food was good and the people were very nice. Never says that he met Austin Rowe, let alone that Austin Rowe was part of the spy ring. So I chalked this one up as another legend, and think that the idea that Washington came to thank the spies is just legend without any real solid proof. The interest in the spy ring continues and is helped by about a dozen books that either fully deal with the spy ring or spying during the Revolution in part. And then there's more interest since 2017, when the state created George Washington Spy Trail that runs 55 miles from Great Neck out to Port Jefferson, has its own logo, has you can dial in and hear at each site information about the site, which links all of these spy ring sites as well as Revolutionary War sites not connected to the spy ring. So that's the end of the story and the spy trail. What I'm going to do now is stop the share and see if we have any questions. And while we're waiting for that,